Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Dania Ferrera, directora ejecutiva de la Asociación Latinoamericana de Avicultura, y en esta ocasión estaremos compartiendo información relevante sobre el uso responsable de los antimicrobianos en América Latina, el Caribe y el mundo. Para dar apertura a este webinar, le damos la bienvenida y el uso de la palabra a la presidenta de ALA, la señora María del Rosario Penedo de Falla.
Gracias, Dania. Buenas tardes a todos. Es un honor darles la bienvenida en esta serie de webinars organizados conjuntamente por la Asociación Latinoamericana de Avicultores y el International Poultry Council. Este evento es un evento que trae muchos beneficios para toda la organización, definitivamente. Es un evento en el cual Latinoamérica se une, porque no solamente reúne a expertos y líderes de nuestra industria, sino también reafirma nuestro compromiso con el manejo responsable de los antimicrobianos en la producción avícola. Un tema crítico para el bienestar animal, para la salud pública y para la sostenibilidad de nuestra actividad. Quiero expresar mi más sincero agradecimiento a Ricardo Santín, presidente del IPC, a Nicolò Chinotti, secretario general del IPC, Annie Nidler, directora del Proyecto TRANSFORM, y Dennis Erpelding, líder del Proyecto TRANSFORM en el IPC, por su invaluable coordinación y participación en el desarrollo del contenido y las charlas que tendremos en estas sesiones. Seguramente serán de mucha utilidad. Su dedicación y liderazgo son fundamentales para el éxito de esta iniciativa. Hoy más que nunca debemos adoptar prácticas basadas en ciencia y en principios de responsabilidad compartida. La declaración de posición del IPC y la guía de mejores prácticas que discutiremos son herramientas esenciales para lograrlo. Además, la integración del enfoque sistémico del proyecto TRANSFORM nos invita a mirar más allá de las granjas, entendiendo que nuestra labor está conectada con la seguridad sanitaria global. Les agradezco por ser parte activa en este esfuerzo y los invito a aprovechar estas sesiones para aprender, intercambiar ideas y tomar acciones que marquen una diferencia en nuestras granjas y en nuestra región. Juntos podemos seguir fortaleciendo una avicultura responsable, sostenible y comprometida con el bienestar de las generaciones futuras. Bienvenidos y que sea una jornada de gran valor para todos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a la presidenta de ALA, la señora María del Rosario Penedo de Falla. Este tipo de alianzas y compromisos son esenciales para fomentar la investigación, la educación y la implementación de estrategias efectivas que contribuyen a la preservación y la eficacia de los antimicrobianos. A través de la colaboración regional e internacional se puede garantizar un futuro más seguro y saludable. Nuestro agradecimiento a la International Poultry Council por continuar fomentando esta alianza de cooperación mutua. En caso de realizar una pregunta a nuestros oradores, agradecemos lo hagan a través de la opción de preguntas y respuestas. Estas preguntas se estarán compartiendo y respondiendo al finalizar el webinar. Agradecemos el apoyo de COP Bantres, quien siempre dice presente a las actividades organizadas por la Asociación Latinoamericana de Avicultura. Y por último, pues agradecemos mantengan su micrófono apagado para evitar interrupciones. Para dar inicio a esta jornada educativa, le damos la bienvenida a todos los participantes y compartimos la intervención del señor Ricardo Santín, presidente del Consejo Internacional de Avicultura y vicepresidente de ALA, sobre la introducción y liderazgo de la industria del Consejo Internacional de Avicultura y su colaboración para la acción.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear poultry producer friends who are following this important event in the webinar online. I'd like to make special greetings to the President of Latin America's Poultry Association, Maria del Rosario Penedo Falla, to the IPC Secretary General, Nicolo Chinotti, to the ALA Executive Director, Dania Ferreira, and the IPC Transform Project Leader, Dennis Halperding. And also to greet the speakers of this initiative, Dr. Annick Nidler, Dr. Thomas Schrock, Dr. Phil Steyer, and Dr. Gonzalo Moreno. Welcome to the Antimicrobial Use Stewardship webinar series. This is a joint initiative between the IPC and ALA, the joint effort to build partnerships that generate important advances for poultry producers around the world. Over the next 3 weeks, every Wednesday at this time, we'll have webinars with different and complementary approaches to the challenge of the antimicrobial resistance. These topics range from risk analysis to the definition of principles for administering antimicrobials, from the concepts of the One Health to the IPC actions to strengthen the sector in the face of this issue, from the action drivers from Latin America to practical care for preserving the health of production. One Health, the principle that unites human health, animal health, and the environment, is a priority issue for IPC. It was within this principle that we established TRANSFORM in our sector, a program funded by USAID and Cargill. Within the concepts and guidelines of this program, the IPC has built its action plan to drive global change across the animal agriculture industry. This occurs with guidance actions to avoid the need to use, but when necessary, ensure the appropriate use of antimicrobials, guidance that occurs in initiatives like this. By generating global poultry industry support for science-based principles to address antimicrobial use, the industry is taking action to combat antimicrobial resistance and reduce its impact on global health security. In total, 26 organizations supported the principles of antimicrobial stewardship, reaching more than 140 countries and representing more than 40% of global poultry meat production. All sectors of poultry production are covered, from fully integrated system to small farms. Each of these organizations is demonstrating industry leadership in its commitment to these principles, recognizing that action starts on the farm. A special mention should be made to ALA, which became a signatory to this initiative last year. By adopting or endorsing the principles, organizations are committing to encourage or take action against AMR. These are principles that endorse a perspective that is specific to the global poultry farming and the total adherence to the sustainability. We are sustainable by nature. We support food security and we fight against hunger. We work for quality of life. We are dedicated to preserving the environment. We are, therefore, defenders of what we define as One Health. So, dear colleagues in the poultry sector, I wish you an excellent event. May the principles we will discuss here become consolidated and increasingly advanced in our sector and in our association. Thank you very much. All the best.
Agradecemos las palabras del señor Ricardo Santín, presidente del International Poultry Council, presidente de la Asociación Brasilera de Proteína Animal y vicepresidente de ALA. En nombre de ALA, reiteramos nuestro total apoyo a la adhesión al proyecto TRANSFORM. Continuando con este webinar, le cedemos la palabra al señor Nicolo Chinotti, secretario general del Consejo Internacional de Avicultura, quien nos hablará sobre el enfoque en principios, su enfoque, principios y prácticas del proyecto TRANSFORM. Adelante, Nicolo.
Thank you, Dania. Let me first thank ALA, so Madam Maria del Rosario, yourself, and Marcelo for the incredible and tremendous support you gave IPC in organizing this webinar. I would like to thank Annie for her tremendous leadership in this project, and Dennis for his tremendous leadership in the IPC part of the Transform project. Thank you so much, everyone online. This topic is key for our industry. I can hardly imagine a topic more important than this one. Probably it's at the same level of the avian influenza, but this topic here is now raising to the headlines of the media. You may have seen some news regarding the United Nations General Assembly, and everything started with the United Nations General Assembly. Next slide, please. Um, before I move forward, just a few words about IPC. For those of you who are not aware of the organization, IPC is the Global Association of Poultry Meat Producers. It's been founded in 2005 and it grew in time, and now we represent 29 countries association, and we are honored to have ALA and several associations from the South America and Caribbean amongst IPC country members. And these figures are slightly outdated, that is my bad. 58 companies active through the world poultry value chain, all the way from breeders up to producers, suppliers, and end users. This is in this slide you can see the logos of some IPC members. And next slide, in the next slide you will see the international organization that are recognizing IPC as the global voice of the poultry meat industry. Of course, the World Organization for Animal Health, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the COAG and the COAG Subcommittee on Livestock, the Codex Alimentarius, the Quadripartite AMR Multi-Stakeholder Partnership Platform, the GASL, which is the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, the Committee on World Food Security, the LEAP project, and not listed here, we are in the process of getting the observer status at the UNFCCC. So likely IPC will play a role in the upcoming COP30 in Brazil. Why I'm saying that? Because if you look at this slide and if you think of the IPC membership, you can understand how IPC is strategically positioned to represent the poultry industry with all those stakeholders. Next slide, please. And as I said, it all started with the United Nations General Assembly. I think it was 2016, and the high-level panel of experts on antimicrobial resistance issued the first declaration on the relevance of the AMR. You may have heard about the silent pandemic, and there was a call to action to every single sector that is dealing with antimicrobials to implement tools and strategies to reduce the use of antimicrobials. And IPC was ready to pick up that call. It was 2017 when IPC issued the antimicrobial use and stewardship principle. And it was 2019 when IPC issued the best practice guidance to reduce the need for antibiotics in poultry production. Those documents are available for consultation and download in the IPC website. So IPC again answered to that call, and it didn't end there. Next slide, please. Thanks to the leadership after that 2016 call to action, IPC decided to further build on his work. And thanks to Cargill and Haifa International, we teamed up in a consortium, and we are now running the Transform project financed by USAID. Please consider that this one, if I'm not mistaken, is the first ever 100% private sector-led project that USAID has ever funded. So this is by itself a great achievement for our sector. But it didn't end there. Thanks to those 26 entities that you see listed here in this slide, the Transform project has been selected by Fortune in the list of the Change the World initiative in 2024. So the poultry industry is strongly taking the leadership in this really relevant topic. And IPC, thanks to Transform and thanks to the initiative in 2017 and 2019, was able to join the quadripartite multi-stakeholder platform on AMR. And thanks to that, the recently issued high-level panel of expert declaration that saw an impact from IPC because we were able to pour our expertise into that declaration. highlighting what the animal health industry is doing, what the livestock sector is doing, which I can tell you is really more than what people think. And I can tell you that the poultry industry at global level with IPC, at regional level and at national level, is probably the most advanced sector in fighting AMR and reducing antimicrobial consumption. Next slide, please. So I would like to thank you all again for your participation in this webinar, again to the organizer. The discussion is going to be a little more technical now than what I can do. I think it's important to underline one more time how this was possible thanks to the commitment and the long sight that IPC members and the poultry industry have shown during the year. And the holistic approach is the ultimate key to success. So on that last sentence, I would like to give the floor back to you, Dania. Thank you all again. It's great being here with you tonight.
Muchas gracias, Nicolo, por su aporte y tiempo. ALA, como representante clave de la industria avícola de la región, tiene una responsabilidad fundamental en la promoción de la salud animal, de la seguridad alimentaria y el bienestar humano. El adherirse al proyecto TRANSFORM busca mitigar la resistencia de los antimicrobianos en la producción animal. Para continuar este webinar, le cedemos la palabra a la señora Annie Nigler, quien es jefe del proyecto TRANSFORM de Cargill, y nos brindará la introducción al enfoque holístico del proyecto. Invitamos a los gremios a adherirse a esta declaratoria. Annie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I would also like to express my gratitude and thanks to ALA and IPC for hosting this webinar on such an important topic, as well as recognize the leadership of IPC and the poultry industry and all the members, including ALA, on this important topic of AMR and antimicrobial use. I'm happy to be here with you today to share a bit more about the TRANSFORM project. So we can go ahead on to the next slide, please. So TRANSFORM takes a One Health approach, as we heard earlier in this webinar, looking at the intersection of animal agriculture and human health. It is a USAID funded project, meaning that it's funded by the US government. And we are a private sector led group leading this project. As Nicolo mentioned, it's quite rare to have the private sector in the lead. And our consortium, or our team doing this work, is Cargill, International Poultry Council, and Heifer International. This work is part of the US government's global health security agenda, meaning it's looking at the health, global health for humans and how animal health intersects and supports global health. We look at promoting animal health with a keen focus on farmers in terms of increased productivity and profitability. We work across small scale all the way to larger integrated farms, and we work in 4 countries, Kenya, India, Thailand, and Vietnam, focusing on the areas of avoiding the need for use of antimicrobials with adoption of biosecurity, farm management, and animal nutrition, as well as expanding the commitment to the antimicrobial use stewardship practices of IPC. Next slide, please. The work of TRANSFORM, we take a holistic approach with the farm as the focus, and we work across 4 integrated components. The first is on-farm practices. We know how critical the work on the farm is to animal health, and so we work with farmers, extension agents, companies to focus on the adoption of on-farm biosecurity, farm management, animal nutrition, and antimicrobial use practices to improve animal health. In addition, we look at animal nutrition research, where we work with universities or other research institutions in country to look at additives. So animal nutrition additives that have the potential to reduce zoonotic pathogens, improve immune response to disease, increase productivity, and avoid the need to use antimicrobials. We also look at access to finance. We know that these improvements on farm require investment, and in some cases that investment is difficult to obtain, particularly for smaller scale farms. So we work with financial institutions, whether that be banks or credit associations to mobilize capital to provide loans to farmers to invest in these improved practices. And finally, the reason why we're here today is the antimicrobial use stewardship principle work led by IPC, where they engage companies and associations to adopt and endorse the science-based antimicrobial use stewardship principles that avoid the need to use antimicrobials and encourage responsible use when needed. This is the 26 companies and associations who have committed to these principles, as Nicolo mentioned earlier, covering 40% of the global poultry industry in 140 countries. Next slide, please. So I just shared what work we do, and now I'm just going to talk a bit about how we do that work. So we work with partners for these activities in the countries where Transform operates. And those partnerships are critical to ensuring that we have this holistic approach. So we work with private sector leaders like all of you here in this webinar to promote the adoption of antimicrobial use stewardship principles. We work with extension agents and agro-vets to ensure they provide training as well as quality inputs. We know that in many places there's a lack of access to the necessary extension support. And so Transform works on building that capability. We also work with media and community leaders. We do broad scale messaging on critical topics around biosecurity, and we do that through radio or through street plays or in partnership with community leaders to reinforce the messaging on best practices. We work hand in hand with researchers on the research trials that we have to generate the evidence around the impact that additives can have on animal health. And finally, we work with financial organizations to improve access to finance. We do this all in partnership with government stakeholders, both those that Nicolo mentioned at the global scale, as well as ministries of animal production or ministries of animal health or similar departments in the countries where we work. And so it's really all of these stakeholders that really are critical to the work that we do as Transform. Next slide, please. And so what is the impact we've had, right? I've shared with you what we do and how we do it. And so what results have we seen? So we really are seeing a validation of the approach we're taking by working in this holistic approach with the private sector in the lead. And we're seeing improved farmer outcomes. We have more than 85% of farmers adopting at least one new practice. The average is 4 practices that are adopted by farmers in terms of improved biosecurity or farm management. We have over 50% of farmers reporting reduced animal mortality and 44% reporting improved productivity. These are significant results and extremely impactful for the smaller scale farmers we work with in terms of improving the health of their animals, but importantly, their own productivity and profitability as farmers. And through these farmer outcomes, we're also having a global impact focused on the areas of most importance for the Transform project in terms of reducing the spread of zoonotic diseases, reducing the spread of transboundary animal diseases, as well as reducing the selection pressure, the AMR selection pressure in animals. We're proud of the results we've had. We know there's more work to do, and we look forward to continue to work in partnership to continue the work that we're able to do as part of Transform. So thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this webinar. I will turn it back to Dania for the next speaker.
Thank you, Annie, for your intervention. El proyecto TRANSFORM fomenta la colaboración entre actores claves como gobiernos, organismos internacionales, instituciones de investigación y el sector privado. ALA fue adherido a la declaración en el año 2023 con el fin de reforzar el uso responsable de los antimicrobianos en América Latina y el Caribe. Para finalizar este intercambio educativo sobre el uso racional de los antimicrobianos, invitamos al señor Dennis Erpelding, asesor científico y comercial para el International Poultry Council. Dennis, le cedo la palabra.
Thank you, Dania, and please be part of this webinar today. As Ricardo noted, we're going to have a series of 3 webinars, so we appreciate the individuals as we think about the private sector leadership in here. Also, myself, I also want to congratulate the leadership of ALA, so President Del Rosario, Dania, with your leadership on being one of the private sector leaders in advancing the antimicrobial stewardship use principles. With that, we'll go into a little bit more of a technical orientation here, but not too deep. We'll have a couple upcoming seminars in the future that'll get more depth on the technical one, but at a high level. So next slide, please. As we think about antimicrobial resistance, as Ricardo, as Niccolo noted, this has gathered a lot of attention at the global level. Recently, the UN high-level one in September. Even as of last week, we had the ministerial meeting in Saudi Arabia as well, building upon the importance of addressing this holistically. As mentioned by Annie, the TRANSFORM project is taking a holistic approach. So we think about the antimicrobial resistance, the issue. We often think about the animal side. We recognize there's what we call the broad reservoir out there that includes the human, the environment, the aquaculture. As a matter of fact, as Niccolo referenced, the quadripartite, part of the reason that came together, so we have UNEP, the environmental group, FAO, WHO, as well as WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health. The reason that came together, we recognize we need to collaborate together under a One Health concept. So as much as this looks very complicated, the critical thing is we recognize our role on the food animal side, so we need to be proactive in that, and that is where the stewardship use principles come into play. So we focus on where we can have impact at the farm level on the food animal side, but also recognizing we're part of this holistic One Health approach in what we're doing in advancing our efforts on antimicrobial resistance. Next slide. As you think about antimicrobial resistance and the One Health concept, the critical thing of most importance that we're dealing with is a concern that if a person becomes sick with a foodborne bacterial infection, that it cannot be appropriately treated with antibiotics as a result of animal-derived antibiotic-resistant bacteria or genes. So we think about the UN recent declaration. They talked about many millions of people potentially getting sick. We recognize that. I think our focus is in what of those resistance pathogens are foodborne. The key ones there are actually Campylobacter as well as Salmonella. And so importantly, even of those, there's a subset that are resistance. So our goal is what do we do from a food animal side, from a farmer side in addressing antimicrobial resistance, and where do we have impact? And that's really where the stewardship principles come into play. So yes, the One Health concept is what we fit into. Importantly though, as we think about private sector leadership, those identified is what we're doing proactively in our private sector in this process. Next slide. So now let's take a little bit more in depth to what we're doing. As Niccolo noted, back in 2017, we adopted our stewardship principles. Then later on in 2019, we adopted best practices. And so what we did is we think about the TRANSFORM project, as opened up by Ricardo, is basically we recognize we're part of this overall One Health need. We said, what do we as an industry do? So IPC back in basically starting in 2016, even late in 2015, started saying we as an industry need to be proactive. We heard the UN discussions. So we said, what do we do proactively? So we said, let's start with what we have control of. That's the poultry sector. So within the IPC, within our working group process, within our membership, all the way through the membership vote, we took the time to establish the antimicrobial use stewardship principles that ties in what we're going to talk here as we think about the TRANSFORM project. In those, I like to frame it up, there's really 4 key components. So if I'm a high-level management person in the company, or even my technical, the 4 high-level ones are basically initially a risk analysis-based approach, management practices, be in compliance with national authorizations, then those highest important in human medicine. Going a little bit deeper on these 4 key principles, as we think about risk analysis, what does that really mean from a best practices standpoint? So within our IPC membership, we said we need to understand and control why and when we use antimicrobials. We need to understand and control which antimicrobials we use. We need to understand and control how much we use. And ultimately, we want to be transparent in our communication. So we think about risk analysis based here, it's really identifying where there's a need. As Ricardo mentioned up front, our goal is to avoid the need, but recognize if there is a need, what are we doing responsible? So that's our first core principle, is a risk analysis-based approach. The second core principle is really around management practices. These include things around biosecurity, housing, nutrition, hygiene, and preventive measures, such as vaccines. And all we're saying is we think about good animal care. What do we do in these areas that really reduce the need for use, or more now, avoid the need for use, as Ricardo noted? So that is our second core principle, is management practices. The third principle is really recognizing compliance with national authorizations. We recognize globally, if we work with the World Health Organization, we work with the World Organization for Animal Health, we work with FAO. Yes, each of these entities have different goals, guidelines that we want to follow with, but ultimately as producers, as farmers, we're also important that we're compliant with national authorizations. So we look at the Transform project. One thing we are doing is working with each country we work in. As Annie mentioned, we're working more in depth in India, Vietnam, Kenya, as well as more recently Thailand. One thing we do is understand what the national regulatory process is. So as we work about our stewardship principles, as we developed these in 2017, we recognize the importance of being compliant with the national authorizations, because those national authorizations do vary slightly by countries. But we want to be compliant with those, let alone meeting our global objectives and goals under the One Health area. The final fourth stewardship principle then is really around those of critical importance for human medicine. The World Health Organization has a list of those antibiotics most important for human medicine, from highly important to critically important to important. For those, we're saying they should only be used for therapeutic purposes and ideally under supervising veterinarian diagnosis and oversight. Now, as we think about this one, this is those that we seek to actually minimize the use of these or avoid the use of these. But we also recognize the role of veterinarians in working with farmers to look at understanding what the situation is from a health standpoint at the farm, and then how do we make sure we properly use if there is a need for use. This also comes into play as we deal globally, is looking at veterinary infrastructure, of how we're supporting veterinary infrastructure in countries and how we work with veterinarians as producers. So in summary, as we think about our four key principles, we take the risk analysis-based approach on understanding when, why, how much, the management practice around biosecurity, the national compliance, then minimize or avoid the use of those important for human medicine. Later on in our discussions that we have in the next couple of webinars, we'll also get into more discussion about definitions and more details about what we mean about these. But this today is really to provide a high-level goal of what we're trying to do in stewardship principles. Next slide. With the stewardship principles, as Ricardo referenced, is one, we seek to avoid the need for use. IPC recognized that back when we developed our work in 2017. We said, okay, now that we have the principles, what do we further do to really avoid or minimize the use? Back then, we used the word reduce the need for use. Now we actually more proactively say, how do we avoid the need for use? So IPC developed in 2019 the stewardship principle guidelines relative to what we do to avoid the need for use. That comes into stockmanship and training, biosecurity, external environment, internal environment, the bird environment, hygiene as we think about houses, hatcheries, flock health and welfare programs, nutrition. Ultimately, then we come into stewardship principles specifically, recognize, avoid, or restrict the use of growth motion, and data collection. So as we go forward and transform, as we get into the holistic approach that Annie mentioned, as we think about on-farm practices, training, and things of that sort, these best practices will directly tie into the Transform initiative, underlining the holistic approach and what we do, taking research, which is part of the Transform that Cargill is leading, taking education and training that Cargill and Heifer International is doing, and then how do we intertwine that or leverage that with what IPC has done here on our best practices. So this ties into our holistic approach in a One Health approach in addressing antimicrobial resistance. So this is kind of a second phase as we look at what we're doing under the IPC Transform project. The first key phase was really focused on endorsement or adoption, such as ALA and such as member organizations of this one, the global entities. Now our second phase is really around best practices. Next slide. As we think about what we're doing in Transform, and this really correlates to what we're doing as a poultry industry, one thing we always do is step back and say, what is that poultry food systems value chain? We're focused here in poultry, but this could be similar for other species as well. So in each country as we work, as we deal with Kenya or India or Vietnam or Thailand, one of the first things we do within our Transform project, within our IPC process, is say, how does this poultry value chain work? So we recognize in some countries, we're dealing with backyard operations. I was just in Kenya last week. Annie was there as well. We actually went and visited some of these smaller operations, so what we might call as backyard. Then you have semi-commercial, more commercial, and then what we call fully integrated. So as Ricardo noted, we recognize, as we think about the stewardship principles, entities across this whole sector have already endorsed or supported the stewardship principles. And so our goal is understanding how that value system works. Then as we think about that, we look at the input side from the chicks and feed. We look at the role of antimicrobials or anticoccidials specifically, and we'll differentiate those in our next discussion. We look about delivery mechanisms, whether it's feed, water, or injection. We think about the professional influencers. We recognize globally as yes, farmers make the final use on what an antimicrobial is, but influencers might be veterinarians, paraveterinarians, agrovet, animal production professionals. Also importantly, as ALA, as we look at IPC, we recognize the importance of associations in this process. So we think about those are influences on what we're doing in impacting the antimicrobial use decisions. Next, we get into the processing part. So you think about the local, some of these countries, the local markets, the wet markets, also more integrated, we get into slaughterhouses. We get into the final markets, so we look at local markets, retail, and quick service. So we think about this whole value chain. We try to understand what that value chain is, where the decisions are made around antimicrobials, and where the influence of those decisions are made in the process. That becomes part of our holistic approach to addressing antimicrobial resistance. We also importantly recognize the role of governments. So the ministries, whether it's agriculture, veterinary, it might include health. As we look about drug approval and regulations, we recognize the role they have there. So this is that value chain approach we look. So if I'm a company or association, I look at what role do I play in this one? Am I fully integrated? Am I more of a backyard? Am I one where I'm an influencer? How do I work with members? This is where we do commend ALA as we think about an influencer for working with members. This is an example of how we share that information of what we do globally. Next slide, please. With that, as we look at the antibiotic stewardship principles where we are, Niccolo outlined the 26 entities that already fully supported the antimicrobial stewardship principles via adoption or endorsement. We're very fortunate as we go into the next few months, we're going to be adding more entities to those along the way. But what we did is once companies, associations said, we want to endorse or adopt the stewardship principles, they importantly said, what do we do next? So we're actually very fortunate. We went back and discussed with USAID through the TRANSFORM project. We said we've been very fortunate to address the stewardship principles. Our members are saying, what do we do next? We actually came out with what we call a second phase of it, taking what I call concept into reality on implementation of stewardship principles. This ties very directly to what Andy said we're doing in the TRANSFORM project. So within IPC, though, very specifically, we're now building out as we come into this last year and this next year is looking at leadership and accountability roles. So we're going to say internally, what do we do as associations or companies who think about that leadership and accountability? The second part, we're looking at materials, tools, Q&As that can be used in training programs. So we're actually in a process, and we'll be sharing this in the third part of the seminar that we have, specifically looking at the materials and developing around training. The third part then is looking at tracking and measurements, reporting, a framework for that, key metrics. So again, we hear a lot of things out there. Everyone's got their ideas of what should be involved in this. They're great, but pragmatically, what do we as a poultry sector we should do? For those entities then involved, we'll be looking at how we come to commonalities of what's common across the area as they think about tracking and measurements. So those would be three things that we'll be looking at as we get into implementation. Pending time available and recognizing TRANSFORM's a 5-year project. We're into year 4 now, but also recognizing the industry can work beyond this. We look at working with the supply chain. We'll look at ultimately be working with reporting components. So as we go forward, this is kind of that holistic approach to what we're doing, and this really builds upon what IPC is doing per se. Finally, I do want to note, Niccolo noted how IPC took leadership of this, as well as Ricardo way back in 2016, 2017. We recognize that those who have already endorsed or adopted stewardship principles have a key role to play for going forward. So within IPC, we have actually got a task force that we've now formed that will be seeking input from those who have endorsed or adopted stewardship principles to providing input into the process here of what we just outlined above. So going forward, this will be a critical part in how we work together. And so we'd ask you, as we've outlined the stewardship principles, as we look at best practices, we'd encourage you to become part of this. If you're ready now and endorsed or adopted it, please feel free to reach out to myself, reach out to Danny and Niccolo and others, and we can make sure we put you involved to become part of one of the endorsers or adopters of the stewardship principles. But a great opportunity. We feel extremely pleased to have been involved and lead within the poultry sector from the private sector standpoint, and also as we go forward. Another thing, as we get into more of the discussion and Q&A, we can talk a little bit more and build upon some of the things that Nicola talked about as we think about our relationship with the international organizations of how we do collaboration with FAO and World Organization for Animal Health. We can share more on that. But again, we're pleased to be a part of the Transform holistic approach, critically important. We thank USAID for being the catalyst funders of this process. We thank you for being the private sector leaders, and now how we're taking this from concept to reality for implementation. Next slide. And with that, thank you very much. And Dania, back to you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for your valuable contribution and intervention during this webinar. Daremos un momento para que realicen sus preguntas a través del chat. Aprovecho este espacio para agradecer nuevamente a COP23, la International Poultry Council y ALA por fomentar estos espacios educativos. A la vez, deseo invitarlos este próximo 27 de noviembre a las 2 p.m. Guatemala, Honduras, 5 p.m. Argentina, Uruguay, al webinar Resistencia Antimicrobiana, la ciencia, definiciones y acciones hacia el impacto.
Dania, maybe if I may, while we're waiting for questions to come in, is Nicola referenced some of the international organizations that we have. Nicola, would you maybe want to elaborate on some of the work we're doing with the FAO and the World Organization for Animal Health, recognizing the key leadership role that IPC has in working with those that you touched on?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Dennis. And again, I don't want to repeat myself, but I think that IPC leaders in 2017 and 2019 were really far-sighted because thanks to those two papers that we produced in those years, now IPC is actively engaging the FAO and WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health. I should say they want to engage us. They are seeking collaboration with IPC because they recognize the value of those papers. One example, the FAO, who is more active in the, let's say, smallholder backyard producers, has asked the IPC to combine those two papers together with the recently, well, now it's about a year and a half, released the Codex Alimentarius Code of Conduct on how to reduce the foodborne AMR, and to come up with a small, agile, easy implementable on the field manual that we are now in the final stage of drafting that manual. And at the same time, I had the pleasure to be together with Ricardo Santina, IPC president, in Paris a couple of weeks ago, I'm sorry, meeting with the newly elected WOA DG, Dr. Emmanuel Soberon, and most of our discussion laid on AMR. How can IPC and WOA collaborate more actively and proactively on AMR on those 4 points that you can find included in the declaration from the high-level panel of experts of the United Nations. And the 4 points are the meaningful reduction of the use of antimicrobials and full implementation of the WOA standard on the responsible use, the use of other tools like vaccination to reduce the use of antimicrobials, and the advocacy for higher investment. As you can easily understand, the first 2 points are strictly correlated to the IPC document and guidelines. So how those 2 papers will impact your life on a daily basis, well, it may not be immediately clear to you, but WOA is setting the standard for international trade, and those standards, almost 100% of the time, are taken as reference when national authorities are drafting and issuing their own internal regulation. So being part of the process at this stage allows you to be in a better position when some official decision will come in the future.
Thank you, Nicolo. We have a question here from Patricio Curte, and it says, are there any manuals or practical guides on this subject available for egg producers?
This is Dennis. I can add in, and Nicola, feel free to jump in. As we work with international sister organizations, we do actually work with the International Egg, IEC, the International Egg Council. So think about the things we're doing with FAO. It'll have a poultry focus, but many of the applications of the principles could be applied to the egg sector. But I think that's one of the things we look at continuing how we work with the International Egg Commission. We work with them in many other areas, such as avian influenza. So I look at Nicola, I think that'll be one of the things that we'll do is initially we're focused on broiler meat, but also actually look at several of those entities that endorsed or adopted the stewardship principles. Many of those actually have layers as well. So I think the principles and concepts very much apply across sectors, but then the details exactly what we do would be there. Annie may want to add in too, because I think some of the things we're doing on the training farms actually obviously has layers involved as well. So feel free to jump in, Annie or Nicola, on that one, please.
Yeah, I agree, Dennis. The work we're doing on farm very much is applicable to both broilers and layers. And as you said, there are farmers who do both or have a breed that can do both. And so I think at the farm level, I think the tools that we've presented here are applicable across the layer industry as well, in addition to the larger work with the international association, et cetera.
I just want to echo what Dennis and Andy just stated. Officially, as IPC, we of course represent the poultry meat sector, so we don't want to overstep anyone. We have an excellent relationship with IC. We are collaborating on several topics. We have some joint position that we are expressing and presenting together before international organizations. At this stage, from an association point of view, we are more than happy to collaborate with IC in the future, putting our expertise, our know-how, our lesson learned on how to elaborate those guidelines and those documents to their service so they can undertake similar initiatives.
Thank you, guys. Another comment, just clarification, please. On slide poultry food system value chain under delivery, there were 3 items listed: feed, water, injection. What you mean by injection? That'll be Dennis.
Yes, good question, Dania. Is what we look at as we think about antimicrobial use, we think about the regulatory authorities, they approve a specific antimicrobial, and usually on the label claim for guidance, they'll say, is this for use in feed, in water, or as an injection? In some ways, that's what I call a risk management measure of how you actually deliver it. So we think about resistance, and we'll have some discussion about this in the next session that Tom Shyrock will be involved in. And then Phil Stair later as we think about on-farm practices. But ultimately, those are the 3 mechanisms I look for how you deliver an antibiotic to an animal. So either via feed, via water, or an injection. And those in some ways are risk management steps based upon the regulatory approval process. But we'll get a little bit more into discussion of those as we come into the next couple of sessions. But those are really what we call delivery mechanisms, how the antibiotic is given to the animal in the process. Now, obviously, an injection would be more of an individual animal process, where typically the oral deliveries, whether via feed or water, would be more through a group medication process typically, but not always. But again, that's guided by labeled directions in the process. Excellent point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Now, a question from Karin Franco to Dennis. What were the key points to first selected before mentioning countries for the Transform project?
I'm going to also ask Annie to join me on this one. This comes back to, I think, Annie, we're both in Frankfurt when we started this decision as we worked through the USAID process. So this is a process where USAID was holistically looking at how we address zoonotic, transboundary, as well as antimicrobial resistance. And it's under what they call their global health security agenda. And so what we did is basically IPC was invited to the table, as Cargill, as Heifer, and others were. And we said, okay, specific antimicrobial resistance, this is where we can take leadership. And we tried to look at where then at that time the global health security agenda was being advanced. This comes back to some of the discussions at the UN high level type stuff that Nicola referenced. And we said, okay, under antimicrobial resistance, these are key countries of priority. And then within given countries, here's more where in-depth needed to be. And I'll turn to Annie on that one. But I think on antibiotic resistance, importantly, for IPC, we recognize it's a global issue. And we also look at impact and influence. So for IPC, we have a global component as well as these in-country components. Annie, maybe you want to add in a little bit more about the specific countries, if you would, please.
Sure, happy to. And you're absolutely right, Dennis. The focus of the USAID Global Health Security has certain countries that they focus on. And then within that, the Cargill and IPC and Heifer looked at where we have existing activity that we can really build on. The goal was to bring to this program the work that each of our organizations has going on already, to really bring those synergies and support. And so we looked at the countries that are relevant to the global health security agenda, and then those where we already had activities or business or programs going on, where we could do that in depth on farm work. So for example, India and Kenya are countries where Heifer has experience working, had teams already established. Similarly, Cargill has work there as well. So that's really how we decided on the countries that were ultimately within scope. However, as Dennis mentioned, the antimicrobial use stewardship work is global. And when you look at that slide of the logos of the entities and companies and associations who've committed to the principles, you will see they're all over the world. And so we are able to do this work in particular globally, and in many different countries as a result of the leadership of IPC.
Thank you, Annie. Just waiting for more questions to pop.
Danny, and maybe as we're waiting if additional questions come up, we will just note, as reference, we have a series of 3 webinars here forthcoming. This one is really geared to the high level. So we really appreciated Ricardo with the introduction. President Del Rosario, we appreciated your high level introduction. As we get into the second part, we'll get more into the scientific detail and analysis on this one. So we'll have Tom Shyrock, a microbiologist, joining us for that session. The third session, we'll have Phil Stayer, who's actually been a former chief veterinary officer with a major integrated poultry company. So he'll be getting into more of the things we think about the implementation. So as I think about the holistic approach on addressing these from an antimicrobial standpoint, the series of the 3 webinars will allow us to get more into depth on some of these topics that are reflected in a couple of the questions we've touched on right now.
Thank you. Sí, reforzar, bueno, que estén pendientes igual de todas las actividades que realiza ALA a través de las redes sociales y correos electrónicos. Como mencionaba Denis, tenemos programado un webinar el 27 de noviembre y estaremos compartiendo más información para que participen. There's another question here. It says, each country has its own legislation regarding the use of antibiotics in the poultry industry. They are working in collaboration with each of the local governments. Have the governments been receptive to this?
Can you repeat that again, Dania,
Okay.
for the question? Okay.
It says, each country has its own legislation regarding the use of antibiotics in the poultry industry. They are working in collaboration with each of the local governments. Have the governments been receptive to this?
Very good question. And Annie, you can build upon this and Nick will add in, but I think we've been extremely fortunate that we look at the private sector as Nicola kind of asserted, this is the first time we've had a private sector funding by USAID, but also we recognize as we operate in countries. So as producers, we've got farmers in the country, so we actually try to work within country. We also actually, early on through the USAID project, work with Cargill as a lead in countries. We actually are engaged with the governments in those countries. And importantly, we're also extremely sensitive to what the National Regulatory Authority is. So as one of our stewardship principles, compliance with national authorization. So our experience thus far has been the governments have been extremely welcoming and collaborative to us. Also, we think about the FAO, the World Organization for Animal Health. They've also been very receptive. I think a critical thing is we've recognized there are what I call roles for everyone, government and private sector. And I think through the Transform project, we're really better understanding how we leverage those roles. So how do we collaborate? I'm going to use example like FAO is doing a lot of work in the sector 3-4, the smaller backyard in some of these countries. So Nicola, what he does in Rome, what we do in country with people, how do we leverage what we're both doing in these projects? World Organization for Animal Health is very involved in some of this data collection. So how do we understand what they're doing? How does this tie in? They also have one of the best risk analysis mindsets out there. And then as we think about what Cargill's doing from the research side, what Heifer is doing from the training side, we recognize in some of these countries, governments are very involved through extension services or other professional groups. So I'd say very much we're definitely working together. Annie, feel free to add in on that one, please, or Nicola as well there.
Yeah, I agree, Dennis. We've had very good relationships with the governments, both at the national level as well as at the local level, so like a county or a district. And I would say in particular, in addition to what Dennis mentioned, we've had really good collaborations with either the Department of Animal Health or Livestock Production and whatever it might be, because there's a lot of support that we can provide to the extension agents who are tasked with training farmers on these practices. And so it's really seen as a mutually beneficial arrangement. And there's really close collaboration, both with the national government, but I would say particularly with the more local government district or county, because of the importance of these activities to the livestock producers, the poultry producers in their area, and knowing that the training and the financial connections with finance that Transform can provide are really in benefit to the producers that they work with. And so it really has been a close and strong collaboration thus far with the governments at all levels.
Well, I can't comment on the government reaction to that better than Dennis and Annie, of course, but I can comment on the international organization reaction to that. As Dennis commented, both the FAO and WOA were really receptive on the initiative that IPC, Cargill, and IFER are undertaking. And also, allow me to say that the most receptive stakeholder in this was the private sector itself, because a lot of companies, entities, they saw a value in that. And sometimes we are too busy in doing our job that we need someone that knocks at our door and show us, okay, this is what you can do better. This is what you can do more. And you put your know-how and the know-how of other IPC members to their benefit. So yes, indeed, I think that everyone welcomed this initiative absolutely at top level.
And Danny, I think I see one more comment there in the chat as we think about the role of vaccination and things like that. I think one of the key things we've learned, and Annie and I were just in Kenya last week on this, is I think it really comes into the whole proper disease diagnosis, which comes to that professional veterinarian. In some of these countries, the agrovet or paraprofessionals. I think with that, then also comes the availability of vaccines. And another component is really the financing. I think so if you think about the Transform project of how we've come together as a holistic approach, I think that's in part why we've added in the finance component, especially in the developing world. Financing becomes a key component of this. So I think as we think about the point is, yes, vaccines are a key intervention, not unlike biosecurity and nutrition and genetics and other animal health. Vaccines become a key intervention. But I think with the holistic approach to Transform, we also recognize the limitations of existing systems and structures. So through Transform, we're trying to address those proactively about how do we influence both the disease diagnosis, the availability, which can be a logistics issue somewhat, and ultimately the financing. So a good example, we're stepping back from a day-to-day and taking a holistic approach really comes into play. And through Transform, we'd be able to do that collaboratively globally.
Okay. Check. Yeah, I think that's the last question, Dennis. Nicolo.
I think there is one more question in the Q&A window. It just popped out. But it's in Spanish, and I will not dare reading that. I'm
just going to translate it right now. Let me see.
Yeah, Danny, if you want to translate, my Spanish is more limited than Nicolo's.
It says, regarding genetics, it is possible to have more resilient breeds that better withstand disease challenges without compromising efficiency and productivity.
I'll just add in, I think what we learned is we take that holistic approach. So if you think about the genetics of the animals definitely play into a role, the farm management, nutrition, biosecurity, vaccinations, this comes to that holistic approach. So definitely genetics. As a matter of fact, again, I can reflect last week as we think about the genetics of the bird, think about, is it a confined bird, one that has more of a scavenger? The genetics play a critical role. So I think it really comes into play as we think about the IPC our membership base, we take all the way from nutrition, genetics, all the way to those involved in the food chain. I think the Transform Project is also a different one. We recognize the important role for each of these in that process. And obviously, you start with the bird. And genetics are a critical part of starting with that bird. So we thank everyone that's part of this process that helps take this holistic approach to truly advancing the biosecurity, food security that we have globally.
Yeah, and I'll reinforce everything you said, Dennis. Agree, and we do in the countries where we work, especially on the on-farm practices, we do work with different breeds that are best suited for those environments, right? Both the environment of the objective of the farmer, how they plan to raise the birds, and those that are locally available and can be easily and safely obtained by the farmers at good quality. And so certainly do ensure that as we work with farmers on these topics, we are taking into account the best breed that's available and is best suited for the farming conditions and the objective of the farmer.
Absolutely agree with Annie and Dennis. And I just would like to add that if you look at the principles that are included in the IPC antimicrobial use stewardship, those would apply equally, independently from the system of production you are using, the breed of animal you are using. So, of course, the choice of the breeds you are growing in your farm is something that goes beyond Transform and IPC. Is something that it's on you, depending on different parameters, as Annie mentioned, of course. But the approach, the mindset, the stewardship of the antimicrobials, that is the same, and that is what really at the core of the Transform project.
Thank you, Dennis, for your intervention. Hoy sí, ya no tenemos preguntas. Igual, pues, recalcar la importancia de este tipo de alianzas que tenemos con la International Poultry Council. Este solo es el comienzo de una relación estrecha. Estoy segura que todos los participantes van a estar con nosotros y van a acompañarnos a lo largo de esta serie de webinars. Como mencioné anteriormente, el 27 de noviembre tendremos un nuevo webinar, ¿verdad?, sobre la resistencia antimicrobiana, ciencia y acción, y luego el 4 de diciembre, que es a nivel ejecutivo y técnico, sobre el soporte a la implementación, ¿verdad? Muchísimas gracias, Nicolò, Denis, la presidenta María del Rosario, y Annie, por sus intervenciones, y agradecemos pues este tipo de espacios que fomentan realmente la educación en cuanto a temas tan importantes como lo es la resistencia a los antimicrobianos.